In the previous lecture, you went through a practical introduction to Kubernetes. In this lecture, you will check the definition of the Kubernetes pod for the REST API server. Let's get started. We will continue using the Fibonacci sample application which we used in the previous section. As a reminder, this application has two layers. A backend which implements the Fibonacci function as a REST API, and a front end that invokes the REST API and prints the result. In this lecture, we will focus on the backend layer. A REST API that serves the Fibonacci function is implemented using the Flask web framework. The input is an integer and the response is the Fibonacci value for that integer in an HTML format. Check the API implementation in the api.py file under the Fibonacci backend directory. Let's take a look at the Pod YAML file, which you can find under the K8 directory. Check the contents of file backend pod.yaml. I like to use a tool such as VS Code to edit YAML files. It gives you a visual representation of the structure of the file and allows you to expand and collapse sections of the file. This makes it easy to understand the nested structure of the YAML file. You can describe the specification of a Kubernetes object using a YAML int markup language file. YAML is a human-readable data serialization language. The basic structure in a YAML file is a map of key-value pairs, simply written in the format key:value. For instance, in line 1 of backend pod YAML file, the API version has a value of v1. To define nested data structures, you use space indentation. You indent using spaces, not tabs. It is a good idea to stick to a 2-space indentation per level. An example of the YAML file is the contents of the metadata section in lines 3 to 7. Here, metadata has a child property with the name It has another child property with the name labels, and the latter has two child properties, app and tier. If you would represent the metadata construct using XML, it would look something like this. To declare an array in YAML, use dashes. Since a pod in Kubernetes can have one or more containers, the Pod YAML file defines an array of containers. In this example, it has an array of 1, see lines 9 to 11. You can see that the container uses an image created under my Docker ID, or Shukri. You can leave it like that and it will work, since I pushed this image already to Docker Hub. If you wish, you can use your own images that you created in the previous labs. In this case, edit the YAML file and replace Oshokri with your Docker ID. A YAML file that defines a Kubernetes object must define the following 4 mandatory sections. API version. Which version of the Kubernetes API you are using to create this object? In line 1, this is defined as v1. Kind. What kind of object you want to create? In line 2, we specify the kind is a pod. Metadata. Data that helps uniquely identify the object. In lines 3 to 7, we gave the pod a name and a couple of labels as a form of identification. Spec. what state you desire for the object. In lines 8 to 11, we specified that the pod would have one container and specified the name and the image for that container. Check the resources attached to this lecture, where you can find a brief reference to YAML and pod reference from the Kubernetes documentation. That's it for this lecture. You have learned about the Kubernetes YAML files and checked the definition of the Kubernetes pod for the REST API server. Head over to the next lab, where you will create a REST API server in a Kubernetes pod.